Okay, so our topic today, and for our guest who's just arrived, Creative Mornings, we always choose a topic around the world to actually disseminate and discuss in different ways from a different perspective, sometimes from artists, sometimes from practitioners, but from the point of view of what does surreal mean to us. So normally I'm on the other side of the camera, but when surrealism or surreal came up as a topic, I thought, well, that's a theme that I completely identify with, and it means a lot to me. So I said to Michelle, I wouldn't mind doing that one because of the fact that it's important to me. That's actually an image from one of my first films that I made, which I will show you a bit more later. So let's see if this thing works. Okay, so just a little bit about me. I have been a graphic designer for 30 years. I've been a professional filmmaker for 15 years, 19 years as a postgraduate teacher. I have 2 masters in film, and one in film production and one in screenwriting from Melbourne University. And my films have been at about 15 international film festivals. I've won a few awards. I've been an expat for 9 years now. Previously, I worked in the Middle East and taught in the Middle East for 7 years, and I've been in Hanoi now for 2 years. I have 1 wife, 2 kids, and 2 very surreal cats who drive us nuts because they don't like being touched. But you know, you can't have everything. So can anyone guess which one's me? Because obviously I have an identical twin. They can never pick. That's my younger brother in the middle, by the way. I'm not going to tell you. It's very surreal. Okay, so when you look up the definition, which is always a good way to start in a talk of what is surreal. In actual fact, I like there's a pointy thing here, isn't there, Michelle? Mm-hmm. That is actually what is in Google. That's what it comes up. And I thought, oh, that's a really nice way of actually saying surrealism, particularly with the upside down E. So I just cut and paste that out. But, having the qualities of surrealism being bizarre, mixed fantasy and fact. And I actually think that is really important, the mixed fantasy and fact, because on a daily basis, I think we live in a very surreal world. The fact that we have guests sitting with masks on their face is very surreal. That's because we live in... That's because... we have to deal with the surrealities of the world. I love this word phantasmagorical as well. It's an awesome word. Say it 3 times, Tom. Okay, so that's what we're talking about. And for me, surrealism, has been a long influence, particularly in my over 40 years of life. Okay, maybe a little bit longer. But people like Frida Kahlo, whose work is incredibly personal and surreal. How can we not talk about Mr. Dali, who in himself is actually a very surreal figure. Magritte, who is a fantastic surreal painter. In fact, I was reading a little story about this image. They believe the inspiration for this painting was his mother committed suicide when he was 13 years old, and when they pulled her body out of the river, her dress had gone over her face, and so that was the inspiration for this surreal image, which is quite sad. But this painting is called The Lovers, and it's a very surreal moment. Less said about this one the better, I think. Escher was a huge influence on my early work as well. I loved the line drawing nature of his work, but the surreal quality, the mazes, the fact that there was the constant repetition, which is also representational of life. If we want to go back further, before surrealism was even coined as a phrase in the early 19th century, 20th century, 1915, is if we actually look at Jan Bruegel and his paintings, and I don't know if you've actually ever really looked at his work, but they're incredibly surreal because, in fact, you'll see skeletons pulling horses of carts full of skeletons, and all of these were parables for telling Christians how to live a moral life, and yet the images themselves are very bizarre and surreal. And so surrealism has actually been around for a long time, and the reason I believe surrealism has been around for a long time, even before the phrase was coined, is because it's our way of coping with realism. It's the way that we actually survive with everyday life, is that things become surreal when they're outside of our experiences. And therefore, as an artist, I actually really love and enjoy a surreal world because of the fact that it reminds us that it's different from what's normal. So, one of my inspirational designers, particularly when I was starting out, was David Carson. And David Carson, if you're not aware of his work, was one of the main designers for Ray Gun magazine. And his work is incredibly surreal, and interestingly, Trung, who's our design student here, should block his ear. He never went to design school. He was actually a professional surfer who then went, I'm going to become a graphic designer. And so because of the fact that he actually didn't come through the traditional route of being a graphic designer through studying, he has a very innovative approach to design. And we would say that, as a design teacher, we would say, oh, he broke all the rules. I don't think he broke the rules. I don't think he knew what they were, and he didn't really care about it. And I think that's what's really important. That's what makes his work so unique and interesting, is because of the fact that there is such an aliveness and an even juxtaposed quality to what he does that I think is so beautiful. I particularly love, this is one of my favorite posters. And one of the things that we talk about in design all the time is it legible? Does it make sense? Can you read it? And in some ways, I don't think it matters with work like that, because of the fact that you get the essence of the message. And that's in some ways just as important as being able to make sense of the message. And in some ways, that's what surrealism is for me in my film and art as well. It's not that it has to make sense to you at a conscious level, but it should try to make sense to you at a subconscious level, if that makes sense. So that when you look at it, even though your mind be going, I have no idea what that means, that a level of awareness that you understand something about it, that you accept something about it. This book is one of the best books that I ever bought on David Carson's work. It's quite old now. It's still, a fabulous influence on my design. And the next David, this is the David show today, if you hadn't noticed, is David Lynch, who's my filmmaker influence. David Lynch, as you may be aware, is a surreal filmmaker. His works, again, are very, very surreal. This image from Eraserhead, which was one of his first films. The shock and horror of Elephant Man. Again, his early films in black and white. Very surreal, very different way of looking at the world. But as he moved through his filmmaking, and you have to remember that David Lynch was an artist before he was a filmmaker. And so he was very much influenced by surrealism, and still is. He very famously had an exhibition in Paris where he actually, and this will probably gross you out, he actually displayed dead cats' heads. And the exhibition only lasted about a week because the smell became so bad that people couldn't actually enter the room. That's pretty surreal. But that's the kind of person that David Lynch is. And when I was a young man, I grew up in a very small country town. And I actually left to move to Sydney, which was one of the main capitals of the city. And it was very surreal for me. I remember actually getting on the train and sitting and asking the woman next to me, was it okay to sit on the seat next to her? And she nearly had a heart attack that someone would talk to her on a public train. And it's just like, okay, clearly I don't ask people what, is it okay to sit in the seat? You just sit. I worked that out pretty quickly. But as a young man in my early 20s, one of the first films, because I had moved to a new city and I didn't know anyone, was I would go to the cinema pretty much every night or every second night, and I would just see everything that was on. because, you know, that's what you do when you don't know anyone. And I went and saw David Lynch's film Blue Velvet. Blue Velvet just blew me away. It was just the most bizarre film. And yet there was something about it, even though it was really shocking and beautiful, that was very coherent and made a lot of sense to me. And this was the thing I think that was very groundbreaking for me as an artist, was the fact that you could still have surreal work that makes sense. And again, not necessarily at a conscious level, but at an unconscious level, I understood the symbolism. I understood, you know, the messages and the semiotics of the images. And, you know, his work is incredibly beautiful, and its aesthetics and the way that he frames and uses colors. And in some ways, he's probably one of the strongest influential filmmakers in my work, because of the fact that I love the way that he frames things and colors things. And then when you look at modern filmmakers like Wes Anderson and other filmmakers like that, you can clearly see Lynch's influences on their work as well. He's a groundbreaking director, you know, and this film, if you've never seen it, is definitely worth watching, but it is not easy watching either, I warn you. The opening sequence, which shows a stunning garden of green grass and beautiful red roses, and a young innocent man finding a severed ear lying in the grass. It's completely shocking to a 20-year-old. If you haven't actually seen Twin Peaks, it's an awesome TV series. It's pretty tragic 80s now, but it's incredibly surreal in terms of the storytelling. And again, even though the narrative doesn't completely make sense like many of Lynch's films, Mulholland Drive, I defy anyone to make sense of that film. But Twin Peaks was an incredibly beautiful experience visually. And when this was on, this was absolutely compulsive viewing. You had to watch it every week. You had to tune in to watch it. And so in terms of you know, influence on my work, he was huge because of the fact that he influenced my photography, he influenced my storytelling, and so now you're looking at some of my own photographic work, and you'll probably see some of the influences of what you've just seen, in terms of that I like to use very ready-made technology. I used iPhones for basically nearly all, if not all, of my photos, but in these photos you will actually see that this is at least 2 or 3 different photos in one photo. I like to use overexposed, I like to use multiple exposed footage, and then I like to play with it to present it in a way that you would look at it differently, because I figured a net on the wall, which is this one, was just taken. Again, when I see the image itself, I go, oh, wow, that's really beautiful, and it's in the surreal displacement of the location that it's in. But then I would like to actually rework the work in multiple ways, to present it in different ways, to make us look at it again in different perspectives. Again, this is just a mop on the wall, but it has several different images overlapped with it. And again, I will use all mobile technology and apps to create this. This is not photoshopped. This has not been created anywhere near my laptop. It's all been done on my mobile phone. That's actually a combination of the 2 previous photos that you saw overlapped with a photo of the phone that I took, and then I did a couple of different versions of the phone, but that's not Batman's phone, by the way. And so I love that textual quality to playing with the images to create, you know, surreal perspective. And I don't think surrealism is actually given much credit these days. I don't think it's in favor. I mean, I'm old enough to never actually fall out of favor with it, but I think surrealism will come back. I mean, in terms of story making and films, there have been many filmmakers that have been working with surrealism for a long time. I love this one. This is Darcy D, my beautiful 13-year-old Chunder blossom. And that's combining it with an image that I recently took at the fabric markets. It's literally just overlaid on top of it. But I just adore the textual quality to it. This is an image of Hanoi's wonderful tiles overlapped with an image from the National Museum. And the thing about the National Museum of Art in Hanoi is it's an incredibly moving place, because obviously a lot of the art that's there has actually been heavily influenced by Vietnam's history with war, which is a fact that it's had a long tradition of invaders, and its art represents that very strongly. And so when I take this image, which was a woodblock cut, and overlay it with the tiles, it changes the meaning to me. This is my mammoth son, again just playing with multiple exposures. That's my daughter and a friend lying on the beach. And again, to me, it's more interesting in its sort of ephemeral, ghostly qualities than it is just to actually, show it in its natural form. Hue, the Forbidden City. And the way that I create these images is obviously it's just being photographed, but I'll then take them into apps like Google Snapseed. So for example, that's my first shot. I've added that shot, which is just the throwaway shot that I've taken somewhere, but I liked the red. And this is what you get. And again, I've done this all on my phone. This is not Photoshop. I've just used available free apps that anyone can download. It takes a little while to do, and I have multiple versions of the photo by the time I finish before I choose it, but it's fun. I enjoy doing this. And I like, the surreal quality of it. I like the fact that you go, oh, it is a little girl. Eventually you work it out. And there's things about that as an artist, I like that sense of discovery. But I actually had an exhibition in Abu Dhabi. I read this quote, which actually really resonated with me, and it said that we all live 80 milliseconds in the past, because scientists have worked out that by the time the message has traveled from our brain, from our eyes to our brain, it's already 80 milliseconds. And I wrote this book for my son when he turned 21. And in this book, it was filled with images from our travels as expats for the last 9 years. And I made a video of it as well, which I can give you the link for later. I can't show you now. But in the video, you can see there, it counts down the 80 milliseconds. And the reason you're going to ask is, why is it 88? Well, Wayne will tell you, my good friend in the room, it's because I can't add. But in fact, I added 2 milliseconds for each member of my family. So after I wrote this book for my son, I only made 3 copies of it, and I gave him one for his 21st story, and then 21st birthday, sorry. And quite a few people said to me how beautiful the stories and images were. And again, the images were very surreal. I would take the photos and I would put layers on them and things like that. So in fact, I self-published it and had a big exhibition with massive size prints of these. And again, when you take an image from Instagram and blow it up, about 1,000 times bigger than it's supposed to be, for anyone who is a designer will know that you have a terrible pixel problem. The pixels look horrible, but in fact, I love that pixelation because again, it becomes very surreal in its presentation. And in fact, if you soften it slightly and lose that harshness of the pixel, it becomes almost like a paint daub. And so these pictures really don't make much sense when you look at them up close, but when you look at them back like a couple of meters away, they suddenly become very, very clear, which is one of the reasons why I created them so big. So I'm going to go back again. We talked about some of the main elements of an artist of surrealism, but one of the biggest influences for me in terms of my study as a designer was Dada. Now, in the early 20th century, when all the design movements were forming all around the same time, the French had their design movement, the Russians had their design movements. The Dadaists were actually from Zurich and Switzerland, and in fact, they didn't call themselves, even though it says here art movement, they didn't call themselves an art movement, and in fact, they called themselves an anti-art movement. They were actually against art, and so their work was completely shocking, and it was meant to be shocking. It was not meant to be aesthetic in terms of its look. one of their most famous pieces, which completely shocked the world, was they took a men's urinal and laid it on its side, and then you could see on the side there they just put the signature of a make-believe artist that doesn't exist. The actual original ceramic of this doesn't exist anymore, it's long lost, but there's a recreation of it in the San Francisco National Gallery, which I've seen. And you can see here the artist just sitting having a cigarette in front of it, as you do. But the insanity of this work, such as taking the Mona Lisa and painting a mustache on it, there's been many discussions about what these letters mean. Many people actually interpret it as a code that means an off-coloured pun, which is not something you would normally say about the Mona Lisa being an off-coloured pun. But these anti-art images and the typography of the design that they did were actually designed to be surreal. They were designed to shock. They were designed to provoke. And when you look at people like David Carson's work, which we looked at earlier, you can absolutely see the influence of this work, and also in other design movements, the constructivists, the futurists, and their work. Incredibly beautiful when you consider that this is from the 1920s. And so Dada was an anti-art movement, it was a statement about World War I. The reason they started an anti-art movement where they said if people are stupid enough to accept a toilet as art, then are they stupid enough to accept the fact that their children have died in this massive war? That's what it was really about. And so for me, surrealism is actually a response to, as I said earlier, the realism of life, the pain of life, the fact that life is actually ugly. And in some ways, surrealism is just as valid today as it was back in the early 1900s. For those who are old enough to remember, and I wouldn't imagine there are that many in this room, but when the 9/11 attacks happened, it was, if you recall, one of the most historic events in modern history because we watched it live. We watched it as it happened. So we may have been telecast a few moments behind what was actually happening in America. We actually sat and watched this happen in live. And the one thing that struck me more than anything was the comment that you heard continually from everyone was, it was so surreal. And yet it was very real. People likened this to a Hollywood movie. Are we sure we're not just watching a visual effects movie? And so I think that in some ways this justifies why surrealism for me is a valid art form still today, because it explains life. So in fact, in my own life, again, you have to work out which one's which. I think I know. But this is me and my twin brother. We were born 5 minutes apart. I was born in the days when there were no ultrasounds. So, in fact, my mother was under the impression that she had no idea she was going to have twins. She was just expecting one child. And the doctor, our doctor's name was actually Dr. Killen, which is very surreal. He kept telling my mother that she's only having one baby because there's only one heartbeat. But twins have, as we now know, simultaneous heartbeats because they are actually from the same gene. And so the two of us grew up in a house that was actually, with my younger brother who came 2 years later, a fairly surreal house because I was the child of a violent father. My father was an extremely violent man. He used to verbally attack us every day, but he would physically attack us as well. And I remember parts of my life growing up watching my older brother, in particular being attacked by my father, being beaten. I remember seeing him being whipped with a hockey stick once. I remember lying on bed with my mother applying ice to our back from the whips from his belt. And so this, again, feeds very much into the surreal quality of my work because many of my images represent death and suicide, many of the issues that I've had to confront being a young person dealing with this sort of trauma. And so one of my first films, this is called Fates of Flowers, was about a young man who committed suicide after getting married, and the images that he could see was of his bride in the water. And this was meant to be purely representational of the famous painting of Ophelia. Ophelia's painting has all the different flowers that represent the different aspects of death and life and beauty. Many of my images, this is from a music video clip that I did, playing with surreal images. This is as time goes on, and we actually videoed this as a stop motion film. And you'll see here, that is actually a boat of ice. We actually had a boat of ice. We photographed the singer and the actress, which was the one before. And then we spent 6 months cutting up the images and putting them back together in a video for the music video. And again, on my channel, you'll see the actual video. We don't have time to watch it today, but you can watch that later. This was my first student film. It was, as you can see there, it's a film about a man who comes home and finds an image of himself on the TV when he turns the TV on. But in fact, the person on the TV ends up trying to kill him. And so in a 2-minute film, it's quite a surreal episode of how does he survive himself. We shot this in one evening with one can of film. It was shot on 16mm. No one shoots on film anymore. Yes, I'm that old. And it was a fantastic experience. Then I went to film school, and in film school we had to make, in the first year we had to make 2 projects. The first one was called an exercise, which was shot on beta. And so even though this film was shot in a real location, I found this fantastic old hair salon, old barber salon, with this amazing wallpaper. And the very sad thing was that it was going to be torn down in about 2 months after we shot this. So I had to find the owner. I had to leave notes under his door, and eventually someone contacted me and said, okay, stop harassing us, you can use the old salon. It was empty, so I had to go back and actually put all of the props in it, find barbers' chairs and everything like that. But the story per se is about this young man who actually comes into the barber shop, who wants a haircut, but he doesn't like to be touched. And the original idea came from my father, who, again, as I said, pretty insecure individual in terms of his life. He never touched us because he hated being touched. And so, in fact, we never got hugs from our father. For me, the whole idea of hugging was a very foreign idea until I actually met Michelle, and, like husband and wives occasionally hug each other. And so I wanted to explore a film about, well, how does a man who doesn't like being touched get his hair cut? Pretty simple premise. And so, in fact, when this young man goes into the barber's and gets his hair cut, a child walks into the shop, and the idea is that for a moment I throw this image up, which is the surreal moment of the film, where a lot of people said, I don't understand it. But, if you'll see there in the background, it says isolation ward. And the reason my father doesn't like being touched was because his mother died of tuberculosis, which, for those who don't realize, tuberculosis is the coughing disease where you cough blood up. And she died when he was 1 year old. And so he was put into a boarding school that was also an isolation school for children who may have tuberculosis, because in those days it was considered a deadly disease. They had no treatment for it, and the only treatment they knew was to lock the people up that they thought might have it until they proved that they didn't. And he spent his first 7 years of his life there, which is why he doesn't like being touched, and which is why he's a pretty fucked up individual, because he lost his mother, and then was put into a home for children and separated from his father. And then later in life, my grandfather remarried and he went into a normal home. But as we know, with children, by that time the damage is done. And so the film actually finishes with the man touching him because of the fact that he accidentally cuts his ear because he is so trying not to touch him. My next film was a film called Crash. Very simple little story about a gay footballer. I grew up with one of my best friends was gay and he was constantly tormented at school. And so I made this film. This was my graduating film from my first year of film school. And you know, the imagery itself was pretty surreal. The film is under 5 minutes long. It went to about 12 international film festivals, but it's a pretty awesome film. This was my master's film, Life's Little Dramas, and making of the film was a complete drama as well because of the fact that many things went wrong with the film. But in fact, this film was incredibly personal, but the film itself is about me. And the idea was that this main character of the film sees all of the people in his film as villains, as cliche villains from television movies and feature films. And so the opening of this film actually shows Alex, who was me, seeing his father vacuuming the floor, but his father is actually dressed as Darth Vader. And the whole film is filled with very surreal moments that are locked in an urban setting to try and personalize it and to try and make it to present the film in a different way from just being a film about child abuse. Because I didn't want to make a film about child abuse. So many films about child abuse and about physical abuse or mental abuse. I wanted to show it in a different way that in fact represented the era that I came from. Yes, I'm old enough to have seen the first Star Wars. I recreated these scenes that, where the two brothers are fighting with Darth Vader that actually represents the father figure. I got permission from Lucasfilm to use. Lucasfilm is actually incredibly generous in allowing what they call fan films. They consider this a fan film. So they don't charge you anything, they give you permission. Their only proviso is that you don't use any of the Star Wars imagery in the promotion of the film. Now, the film actually did quite well. It won a couple of awards. Canada really loves my films for some reason. It went to a couple of international film festivals there. It won some awards there. This is actually an image of the brother who starts to disappear towards the end of the film because of the effects of, you know, the abuse. And interestingly, the film finishes, and spoiler alert, sorry, the film finishes with the mother leaving the father, which to me seemed the only logical thing to do when you have such a physically abusive parent. And I think as a child, I really wanted my mother to leave my father, even though ironically it would have abandoned us with the monster, but I wanted her to save herself. Not that she was ever physically abused. He never touched my mother. He always beat the children, but she very quietly watched all of this happen. And she did, in the story, she does leave. And ironically, my mother has just left my father after 60 years this month. She's decided that she can no longer bear to live with him anymore, and she's actually told him to move out. So it's taken her long enough, and I celebrate the fact that she has finally come up with the strength to do it. But it's funny, I predicted this in my film 15 years ago, so, you know, and that's the end.